record. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the EV Facebook shopping guide. And I'm here with John Voelcker. Hi, John.
Hey there. How are you? Happy holidays.
And you too. I'm going to read John's bio for us. Reporter and analyst John Voelcker has been on the EV beat for about as long as any journalist. He founded Green Car Reports and edited it for 9 years, although he recently celebrated his 1-year anniversary at Car and Driver magazine. John's coverage includes EV technology, state and federal policy, and the real world experiences of driving electric vehicles, which is partly why we like him so much. And something I didn't know, just learning in my build up to this, is that John is an actual engineer. He received a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Engineering from Stanford. So I asked John today if he would speak with us about the used electric vehicle market. And my main question, of course, is how important is it to mass adoption and equitable adoption for all communities? I'm going to note, as John will fill us in with a lot more facts, but for instance, a new Nissan Leaf can be had for $20,000 at the moment if one qualifies for the $7,500 federal tax credit. And other lesser known new EVs like the Candy, much lesser known, are listing for about 17.5. Meanwhile, there were a lot of used EVs, used Leafs rather, on Carvana just yesterday when I checked, going for around 13K. Though of course range decreases parallel with cost. So I'll go back to that question, John. How important is the used EV market to mass adoption?
I think the used EV market will become more and more important to mass adoption. However, it's important to understand that if people hang on to a car for 5 or 6 years, the number of EVs sold 6 years ago and further back is really pretty small. I mean, we're talking in some years fewer than 100,000 in those early years. So there aren't that many used vehicles out there compared to what we expect there to be, say, 5 years from now, given the increasing sales numbers. So that's number one. Your point about new Nissan Leafs is appropriate, although, as you also underscored, not everybody can take advantage of the $7,500 federal tax credit. You also have to finance that up front and then get it back on your taxes on the back end unless you lease, just to point that out. The only other point about that, you mentioned the Candy. I'm afraid you have to count me among the skeptics of Candy, the company, its promises and its products. They are not selling that as a real passenger vehicle that is highway capable. Right now, they're selling it as a neighborhood electric vehicle, which works in a certain subset of circumstances, but it's not a real vehicle. It's not crash tested by the federal government. And I frankly would be hard pressed to recommend anyone outside a retirement community buying one. So real EVs above that level, absolutely. Probably the largest number is used Teslas, but those are still as expensive used as some of the vehicles like used Leafs that you talked about. So really, it's going to become more important than it is right now, but especially given the shortage of cars today and the difficulty in buying any newer used car and the horrendous prices therein, there aren't going to be as many of them as in future years.
So is that going to be a real drag or impediment then on the next few years' adoption, do you think?
I think it's all good in the sense that every used EV that gets sold, unless they're all being bought by current EV drivers, which I kind of doubt, will be another EV driver, someone who gets through the learning curve, understands some of the advantages of EVs, and then becomes, in many cases, an advocate and tells their friends and neighbors and family and coworkers about EVs, and you sort of get that education spreading. There just, I don't think, are going to be as many of them as new EV drivers.
And you know, those figures that you use, the statistic I read for the average length of time an American keeps their car is 12 years. And yet that doesn't seem to bear out in my real world experience. And you said 5 or 6 years.
Well, that 12-year figure might actually be the average age of the car on American roads. Cars are better and better built, and the average US household has 2.4 cars or something like that. So the average car out there on the roads is now 2009 model or something like that. And there's a really long tail, especially in states where things don't rust like yours. But I live in a state where things rust quickly. But what that indicates really is that there are a lot of used cars out there. And I don't know what the average number of owners is, but we talk about new cars, 17 million a year in an average year, which we're not in. But if you average it out, the US buys about 17 million new vehicles a year, largely replacement vehicles. There's not a lot of people suddenly deciding to buy a new car, and the people who come into the market are kind of balanced by the people who go out of the market. But 17 million new cars a year, 40 million used cars every year, which doesn't get talked about because the automakers don't have any skin in the game there. So 3 times as many used cars are sold as new cars. So it is going to be a big part of the market. But again, with that lag that you mentioned, it's going to take a while.
Right. And where does the equity picture fit in here? Because I talked to J.R. DeShazo not long ago, and he said, for mass adoption, all communities are going to have to move into this to buy electric cars or lease electric cars. Used EVs are less expensive. Disadvantaged communities need to find a cheaper car. Can you sort of fill that out?
The overall point that, in fact, everybody has to be driving these for mass adoption, absolutely on target. I'm not as convinced as some people in the equity world that a used Nissan Leaf, especially an older and most affordable used Nissan Leaf, which may only have 50 miles of range left, is the right solution for disadvantaged communities and their drivers, especially because many of those disadvantaged communities have many more multiple dwellings and apartment buildings, or many, many people in the same residence. And that makes charging more difficult. For new cars now, I actually did an article last summer. New cars are now 46 grand on average. The pricing is staggering. And it's risen a lot during the pandemic and the chip shortage. But if you look at the households that can afford to buy a new vehicle, which is where the bulk of EV sales are coming from in the next 5 years, 80% of those households have dedicated off-street parking, which means they will be able to charge at home overnight, just as most Tesla owners do today, and so on and so forth. So the challenge for disadvantaged communities is twofold. The cheapest EVs right now have the lowest ranges. And I, quite frankly, would be hard pressed to buy a 50-mile car, even as a second or third car, let alone as primary transport. And even if that works for some of those drivers, the charging thing is harder. That will abate over time, we hope, with laws, with multiple dwelling owners sort of realizing, yes, you got to have it, just like you got to have heat, not water. But for the moment, I think the question of equity remains to be seen how it shakes out.
Right. And possibly car sharing could be a tool for that.
Yes, EVs are definitely ideal for taxis, ride sharing, car sharing, all of those services where there are a lot of miles put on the cars, especially if there's good fast charging infrastructure and the car doesn't suffer from repeated fast charging, as some early EVs did. But that may or may not fit in to the needs of those communities. It would be ideal if every Uber or Lyft or what have you, even if you have and I've had these stories firsthand in talking to Uber drivers, where you get a group of people who are working in a given factory who get together and share an Uber to work and away until they collectively save up enough to afford their own vehicle. So electric cars are perfect for that because Uber drivers put a ton of miles on their cars. That may be a way to get it in there. And it's also an exposure to EVs as compared to your basic clapped out minivan.
Right, great. So I will note that we have on the website, on our pinned post, a link to a Kelley Blue Book guide to buying an electric vehicle, a used EV. But John, what are your tips if someone wanted to do this right now?
Well, I would say you need to do more research with a Nissan Leaf than with other vehicles, other high volume vehicles anyway. And we go into one sentence of technology here. The Leaf does not liquid cool its battery pack. So under extreme circumstances, whether it's Phoenix weather or whether it's multiple fast charging and no slow charging at home, or just really aggressive drivers, some Leafs we have seen have higher rates of battery degradation. So one of the pieces of advice is, and I'm not going to talk about, there's a ton of low volume vehicles out there, but the numbers are so low, it doesn't really, for the major ones, think harder and do more research on a Leaf than on other ones. Teslas still have the best charging network available, supercharging, and there are more of them than any other single brand, but they are more expensive, as we talked about. So it's a matter of weighing all these issues. It's hard to do advice that will last this particular year, because I've been saying for 9 months now, do whatever you can, whatever you need to paste your existing car together, keep it running for another 9 to 12 months. Do not buy a new car. Do not buy a used car this year. You will pay through the nose for it. Things will probably get better next autumn, maybe quicker, but this year is such an anomaly that it's a little bit hard to do generalized advice, EVs or otherwise.
Yeah, I have a friend who he's a broker, an EV broker, new and used, and he said the exact same thing, and he makes his living selling cars, and he said, wait, so.
The amount of dealer adjustment entries below the bottom line of the window sticker are staggering. I've never seen this, but dealers putting $10,000 on a Mustang Mach-E, which is a desirable EV. There was a famous case of a dealer, I don't know if you know the Mitsubishi Mirage, one of the cheapest new cars sold in America, very small, not a particularly good car, but serviceable. $18,000 on the sticker, $6,000 above that. Yeah. That's just almost indescribable to people who do what I do and have done it for a while. So yeah, keep your current car going. Right. Do your research on EVs now and plan to buy next year.
Right. But we had a question actually on the page.
Okay.
Where do I go to make sure that, say I'm going to use some names here, whether it's Carvana or wherever I'm getting this used EV. Mm-hmm. How can I take their word for it that the battery is good? Because I think that is everyone's chief concern. And if not, can I take it somewhere else, and where would that place be?
That is a great question. I actually have an article sort of in the works on this. What I can say is Nissan Leafs, unlike many of the others, have a battery life indicator in their instrument cluster. You start out with 12 bars, and if a bar goes away, your battery has lost a certain percentage of its capacity. You probably want to avoid Leafs that have fewer than 9 bars. I would say 10. But again, price versus trade-off, range versus what your needs are, et cetera. There is a company out there called Recurrent that is starting to aggregate data by getting EV drivers to plug in a little transmitter to their OBD2 port, essentially to send information to Recurrent about state of battery health and how their range now, after X miles, compares to the range when new. And Recurrent is aggregating this data. They are starting to package it in a way that used car dealers can use. you essentially, where does this car sit against the average of this particular model, this mileage, this year, et cetera, of EV. They're in very early stages right now. Most dealers don't have it yet, but that is a relatively promising development, I think. And we need more of it. This will clearly become much more of an issue when there are hundreds of thousands of used EVs on the market, which there aren't right now. But your reader's question was absolutely the right one to ask. And I hope to have a much better answer when you ask me next year.
Well, we will follow your coverage. And maybe I'll get somebody from Recurrent on here eventually.
Yeah,
sounds really interesting. Your last question, I can't help but switch to journalism generally. And while no two media outlets are alike, of course, do you have a message, being so steeped in electrified technology coverage for so long? Do you have a message for mainstream media about their EV coverage?
There's a bunch of ways to break it down. There's the business. There's a lot of stuff about infrastructure right now. There's a lot of stuff about the industrial production of batteries, battery minerals, all of that. But I'm going to keep the advice to the broadest element of road tests, which sort of boiled down to I or somebody I knew spent some time in an electric car or borrowed it for a weekend, and here's what I learned. One of the things that someone who gets an electric car for a weekend and hasn't done their research doesn't spend enough time on is, how does a real electric car owner actually use that car if they've put down their 40 grand or whatever? The number of journalists who have put out articles saying, well, this is unusable. I plugged it into a 120 socket and I couldn't do a 300-mile road trip in 5 hours is irritating, let's say. And so many of them need to make a better effort. And these are essentially not the people in the auto press. I think it's fair to say now, absent a few people who are banging a particular political drum, the bulk of automotive journalists now know far more about electric cars, how they're used, how to charge them, the differences in kinds of charging, than they did even 2 years ago. I've seen this progress and it's very encouraging. So this is more sort of general media, but we're going to get more and more general media out there as your, I don't know, do they still have local newspaper writers? All of these random people start to test an EV, someone heard something, a neighbor had a story. A lot of it is still a little off target, and I wish they would do more research and talk to actual EV owners before they test the damn thing. Awesome.
Fantastic to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good holiday.
Take care. Happy holidays.
You too. Bye-bye.